I'm Matt Ellman, and you're listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast. We've got lots of useful tips and tricks to help you plan your school year as you prepare your learners for their Cambridge English qualifications. Whether you've been teaching exam classes for years or just at the start of your teaching career, come along with us. We'll help you unpack the English language exam journey using our own real-life experience and easy-to-follow examples from the exam preparation course Complete. So, let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by me, Matt Ellman. I'm the Professional Learning and Development Manager at Cambridge, designing and delivering training for teachers, institutions and ministries of education around the world. I've worked as a teacher and trainer in the UK, Spain and Malaysia, and I've delivered courses, workshops and talks in around 30 countries. Hello and welcome back to another podcast in this series for B2 First for Schools. Today we'll be thinking about getting towards the end of the exam journey and the exam itself and really focusing on understanding what is the examiner looking for. Now for many students this is often a complete mystery. The examiner seems like a kind of all-powerful figure who just makes decisions on a whim, and that adds to their nerves because there's a kind of real unknown there. Is the examiner going to like what I say or write or not? But what we want to do is to demystify the whole process and help the students understand that there are specific things that the examiner is looking for. And what that will do is it will help your students do well in the exam, but it will also make them feel less apprehensive on exam day because they know that it's not just about pleasing the examiner, it's about ticking the right boxes so that they can prove their English skills to the examiner. So we'll do this in three ways. We're going to talk about the resources available to you, and these are resources that we've seen before. They're the handbook, the B2 First for Schools handbook, and the speaking test videos. We'll talk about what you can do in terms of the writing paper, and finally we'll talk about what you can do in terms of the speaking paper to understand exactly what the examiner is looking for and help your students get to grips with this. So, first of all, using the handbook and using the speaking test videos, we've seen before that these are really important resources in helping your students visualize success. But now we're going to use the same resources to help your students understand what the examiner is looking for. If you take a look in the B2 First for Schools handbook, then it's got sections on all the different papers and it explains the criteria for success in all of those papers. The two that are probably most of interest to your learners are the writing and the speaking paper. And in the handbook, we can see exactly what the criteria are for examining writing and exactly what the criteria are for examining speaking. Not only that, but we get examples of candidate writing and we get some examples of candidate speaking in the speaking test videos. And we can use these to put our students in the place of the examiner. So we can have an activity where we say, right, you're the examiner, let's watch this speaking test video and you decide what score these candidates should get. Obviously to do this, the students need to know what the criteria are. And I suggest that you approach these one by one. So you might do one video where your students are focusing on just one element. So that could be, for example, pronunciation. You grade these candidates on their pronunciation, and we'll talk about that afterwards, and compare it with the grade that they got in the handbook. Same thing for writing. You can show your students pieces of student writing, and it's a good idea for them to do this in pairs or in groups so that they can read it and then as a group or as a pair come to a decision about what the right score should be. And as before, it's a good idea for them to do this just focusing on one criterion initially. So it might be their organisation, for example, of the text. What's the right score for organisation if you look at this text? Putting the students in the role of the examiner in this way helps the examiner to seem a little bit less scary, but it also really highlights to your students what they need to do in order to get a good score in the exam itself. So let's look in a bit more detail at how this might work for writing. How do we help our learners understand what the examiner is looking for in the writing exam? Well, part of this is putting them in the role of the examiner, so your learners become familiar with the assessment criteria, that they know the examiner is looking for the right content in their answer, The examiner is looking for communicative achievement in their answer. They want the answer to be organised, and the examiner is looking for the right language, the right range and accuracy of grammar and vocabulary in the writing. Of these four things, the one that students struggle with the most, I think, is communicative achievement. Communicative achievement is not something that is traditionally tested in schools in exams. When students do their English exams in schools that are set by the school or set by the teacher, it's usually filling in the blanks and it focuses very much on grammar or vocabulary. The difference with Cambridge exams is that the whole exam is designed to help you become a better user of English. And what that means is being a better communicator. So communicative achievement means that you get your message across and you do what you want to do with English. When it comes to the writing paper, let's take an example from Complete B2 First for Schools. I'm looking at Unit 4 and I'm on page 48 and there's a writing task and it's a restaurant review. Communicative achievement in the case of writing a restaurant review is explaining to somebody whether the restaurant is worth visiting or not. Does the reader want to go and visit this restaurant, or is it a place that they should avoid? But the elements that affect communicative achievement are elements of context. So if we play around with different parts of context, we can play also with our students' sense of communicative achievement. The skills are the same, so the content will be the same. We're still writing about food, still writing about a restaurant, but the communicative achievement aspect will be different. So let's think now about the writing paper. What is the examiner looking for in the writing paper? Well, if we take a look at the handbook, we know that the examiner is looking for four things. They're looking for the right content as part of the answer. They're looking for communicative achievement. They're looking for the answer to be organised in an appropriate way. And they're looking for the range and accuracy of grammar and vocabulary. Of these four things, communicative achievement is the one that usually poses the students the most problems, because traditionally this is not something that is focused in their lessons at school or their exams at school. Usually a school exam set by a teacher is a fill-in-the-blanks exam that focuses on grammar and vocabulary. But communicative achievement is really about becoming a better user of English, and that's what Cambridge exams are all about. Communicative achievement is about doing. It's about getting the right outcome from your writing or your speaking in the real world. And this all depends on context. So let's break down the context a little bit. Context has three elements. It has the people who are communicating with each other, and between those people there's a relationship, and each person has their own goals that they want to achieve. The second element of context is the topic that people are talking about or that they're writing about. And the third element of context is the medium. Are they speaking or are they writing? As an example of this, we can take a look in Complete B2 First for Schools. And I'm looking at Unit 4, page 48, where the students have to write a review of a restaurant. So the context here is that we have a writer writing a review and a reader. And the writer either wants to persuade you that the restaurant is worth visiting or that it's not worth visiting. That's their desired outcome. The topic is the restaurant itself and the meal that the writer had. And the medium is written. This is a text, and a restaurant review will probably appear in a newspaper. My question for you now, and I encourage you to pause the podcast and think about this, is how can you use this to develop communicative achievement with your learners? Pause now and have a think. Okay, so hopefully you've got some ideas. Let's see if we came up with the same things. When your learners do this restaurant review task incomplete, the language that they use, the grammar and vocabulary, is all about restaurants. It's all about food and eating. That doesn't have to do with communicative achievement. The communicative goal is to persuade me to visit the restaurant or to persuade me not to visit the restaurant. We can develop this skill by changing the elements of context. So we can change this from a restaurant review to an email, for example. And if it's an email, it might be an email between two friends. And the way that you persuade me to visit the restaurant or to avoid the restaurant is different than it would be in the restaurant review. The communicative achievement is the same. The need to do this is the same, but the way that we achieve it is different. So if we play around with elements of context, we can develop our learners' ability to achieve what they want to achieve when they communicate. We could change it again. We could change the situation from written to spoken. And it could be your friend's mum asking if you like the meal that she made for you. Now that's a very different communicative scenario. It's a very different communicative context to a restaurant review in a newspaper. And your response to it and the interaction will be different. So your learners need to really focus then on what they want to achieve and on the language that they need to use to achieve it. Think about how you do this every time your students do a piece of writing. You can use that writing task and extend it to play around with communicative achievement. Ask your learners how they can change aspects of the context. Can they change a restaurant review to an email? Can they change it to an article or a report? Doing that will help to develop their skills in this particular aspect of communicative achievement. And as before, get your learners to read their own writing and to read each other's writing and be the examiner and decide for each other if they've got the right level of communicative achievement in that text. Finally, let's talk about speaking. What's the examiner looking for in the speaking test? Well, again, if we look at the handbook, we know that the examiner is looking for 4 things mainly. They're looking for accuracy and range in terms of grammar and vocabulary. They're looking for discourse management, which is kind of the same as organisation in the writing paper. They're looking at pronunciation, and they're looking for interactive communication. And of these 4 things, discourse management and interactive communication are often the tricky ones. So let's focus on those for a moment. Discourse management relates to fluency and the student's fluency and their ability to keep talking and to organise what they say. Often, the biggest problem that students have when they get in the exam room is that they just draw a blank on the topics that come up in the speaking test. And a nice strategy that I've used for a long time with my students is to ask them to think about 3 aspects, and you can do this with more or less any topic. So the 3 aspects are the economic or financial aspect, the psychological aspect, and the social aspect. And this gives you 3 things to talk about straight away on more or less anything. And the important thing to emphasize is that when your students use this in the exam, that they kind of number the things and say firstly, secondly, thirdly, or that they say, well, I can think of 3 things. First of all, blah, blah, blah. Let's have a look at an example from Complete. I'm looking at Complete B2 First for Schools. I'm on Unit 8, page 91. And there's an example of speaking part 4, and the examiner's saying, do you think schools should teach subjects such as dance, drama, or music? So if I applied the 3 areas that I've just mentioned, I might say something like, first of all, for the psychological element, something along the lines of, well, dance, drama, and music are often subjects that students really enjoy. They're the types of things that students do to relax. So there's a lot of positive energy in a dance lesson or a drama lesson or a music lesson. So that would be one reason to include these things on the curriculum. Something like that. It's just about the psychological aspect of the topic. If we think about the economic or the financial aspect, I might say something along the lines of, well, these are subjects that can be taught with relatively limited resources. You can carry out a drama class just with the people in the room. Maybe something like a music lesson requires more resources because you need to pay for instruments. So that might be a reason not to include it. And when it comes to the social aspect, I might say something along the lines of, While a subject like music or a subject like dance is something that brings people together, it encourages the students in the room to socialize and to develop a good bond between them, because this is what we do in the real world, to socialize. So that might be a positive reason to include it on the curriculum. So you can see how those three aspects can be applied, and you can think of any other topic, I don't know, work, the environment, travel, in which those three elements always apply. So encourage your students to use this strategy anytime they do a piece of speaking in the classroom on any unit. It will become a habit for them, and that means that on exam day, they'll just reach for it naturally and they won't have any problems thinking about what to say. If we're thinking about interactive communication, there are different levels to this, and I think it's important to start small and ensure that we're, again, making it a habit. So the first level is simply to encourage your students to listen to what other people are saying. This might sound like a simple thing, but often students kind of spend the time when someone else is talking just preparing and thinking about what they want to say. It's really important that they're listening to what the other candidate is saying or to what their partner in the group is saying, so that they're ready to respond and maintain the same topic. The second element is to use simple phrases to invite others to speak. So you might finish what you're saying and say something like, "What do you think?" Or "How about you?" So this is an easy strategy that brings in the other candidate and doesn't require too much thought. Again, it just needs to become a habit and your students will pick it up pretty quickly. The third level, and the kind of top level here, is to not only listen to what partners are saying, but then to respond to it in your answer and to say things like, "Oh, I really liked what you said about blah, 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 because I agree with this aspect, whereas blah, blah, blah." This is more difficult to achieve, but I think it's something that students can do if they've already built in those first two levels of listening, first of all, inviting a response, and then finally kind of including what your partner has said is a natural third step. But again, these should be habits that you develop right through the exam journey, if possible. So this ties in really nicely with a question that we had from Neelam. So Neelam asks, how can we make students good listeners when they're practicing for the speaking paper? Their anxiety doesn't allow them to focus. This is a really good question because I think it's a very common problem. And what I would suggest is that she tells her students to listen either for one thing that they agree with and one thing that they disagree with, or to listen for some of those three elements that we talked about before. So does the person speaking talk about the psychological, the economic, and the social element? And if they don't cover all three, maybe there's a third element that you can slot in and you can add to what they've already said. But I would say either think about what you agree or disagree with, or both, or think about what you can add to what they've said by considering those traditional three aspects that we've already talked about. So thanks so much for getting in touch, Neelam, and I hope that answers your question and helps your students. Let's recap. So we've talked on this podcast about understanding what the examiner's looking for. And our key resource here is the B2 First for Schools handbook and those speaking test videos that are on the cambridgeenglish.org website. When it comes to writing, we want our students to focus particularly on developing their communicative achievement, because that's something that they may not have done in the past. And when it comes to speaking, we want to focus on discourse management and helping our students to start talking and keep talking using those three elements: the social, the psychological, and the economic. I hope that works for your students and for you, and I wish you good luck in your B2 First for Schools exams. That's it for today. Discover more episodes from this series on our website, cambridge.org/completeconfidence. We have podcast episodes for every level of the Cambridge exams. Come back and join us again soon. And don't worry, you've got this.
You've been listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast, brought to you by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.